The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, everyone. We're going to wait just a few seconds for the rest of our attendees to join the webinar. It's great to have everyone back to the Zero Suicide webinar series this week. Today's webinar, the fourth in a 6-week series, is Implementing the Workforce Development Survey. This event is brought to you by the Center for Health and Learning and the Vermont Suicide Prevention Center under funding from the Vermont Department of Mental Health. Again, I am Zan Lewis, Program Specialist at the Center for Health and Learning, and I am the moderator for today's webinar. Just a quick reminder for everyone that the webinars are being recorded and will be available on the Vermont Suicide Prevention Center website 1 week after they are broadcast. I'm going to paste an updated link in the chat momentarily. You can also email info@healthandlearning.org to request a password to access the recordings. I think most folks have been here before, so if you do have any technical problems at any time, please type a message in the chat box to me. Today, my name is Zan Lewis, but today I am under the name of my colleague, Gwen Moosin, G-U-E-N-M-O-U-S-I-N. So feel free to chat Gwen, and I will respond with a message directly back to you. Thank you for your patience if it takes me some time to respond. As a quick reminder, please take a minute to complete the evaluation that will pop up on your screen when we close your webinar today. We really appreciate the feedback that folks have been sharing with us thus far. I will now introduce our three presenters, Joellen Tarallo, Tom Delaney, and Michael Hartman, who were with us last week. I'll put their bios in the chat box in case you missed our last webinar. Thanks, I'll hand it to you.
Great, good morning everybody, and welcome to the introduction to using the Zero Suicide Workforce Development Survey webinar training. As you may know, this webinar is designed and presented by CHLVTSPC under funding from the Vermont Department of Mental Health and is part of a 6-part series designed to engage healthcare organizations in a zero suicide program development process in their organizations. Vermont Suicide Prevention Center works with organizations to undertake this work and invites you to contact us for more information about how we can assist you. We did look at the evaluations from the last webinar, and a couple people indicated some redundancy, so we've made an effort this morning to streamline and cut down on some of the overlapping slides from the previous webinars. The Vermont Suicide Prevention Coalition developed the Vermont Suicide Prevention Platform as a guidance document for Vermont in 2015. There are 11 goals in the platform, and it uses an ecological approach based on the National Strategy for Suicide Prevention. This webinar series supports goal number 7, promote suicide prevention, screening, intervention, and treatment as core components of healthcare services with effective clinical and professional practices. Towards the end of the webinar, we show you a slide with directions on how to access more resources, and you can also find the comprehensive strategies outlined in the Vermont Suicide Prevention Platform and a PDF copy of the platform there. We are pleased to announce that Adam Lesser of the Columbia Lighthouse Project and Kevin Crowley of CAMS, Collaborative Assessment for the Management of Suicide Care, will be presenters on next week's webinar number 5, Identification, Assessment, and Treatment of Suicidality. It will be important to have your behavioral health directors and directors of clinical services participate in that webinar. We're also pleased to announce the dates for the Vermont Zero Suicide Skills Institute, to which you would send your Zero Suicide steering committees and clinical leaders. It is now set for May 7th and June 6th. The first day of that institute will provide built-in time with technical assistance and support for teams to work on their organizational self-assessments. We're pleased that Dr. Michael Hogan, who has provided national leadership for Zero Suicide, will be working with our teams in Vermont on May 7th. The second day, June 6th, Adam Lesser of the Columbia Lighthouse Project and developers of the CSSRS and Kevin Crowley of CAMS will be taking a deep clinical dive into identification and assessment. A flyer with information about registration will be available shortly. These are the metrics that Vermont has committed to in the all-payer model goal number 2, specified reducing suicide deaths. You can see that goal number 2 includes the language, reducing deaths from suicide and drug overdose. Vermont has chosen this target as a metric of success, and reaching this metric will necessitate adoption of principles and practices of a suicide-safe pathway to care. We have previously reviewed epidemiological trends of data in Vermont and will not be addressing that today. In today's webinar, participants will be introduced to the Zero Suicide Workforce Development Survey as a leadership engagement and program planning tool, how the survey has been implemented in Vermont Zero Suicide pilot projects, and briefly talk about next steps in your planning. If you have any questions as we begin today, please write them into the question box to Gwen. While you'll be on mute during the presentation, we encourage you to type your questions into the question box now or at any time throughout the webinar. In just a moment, a poll will pop up on your screen during this webinar. Please participate. The 2 questions are, at this point in time, to what extent do you have leadership support for implementing the Zero Suicide Workforce Development Survey? Not yet, beginning to engage in discussion or commitment. And the second question is, we regularly assess staff in our organization about their readiness to screen and assess for suicidality. This will appear as true or false. Zan, would you launch the poll?
All right, you should see question 1 coming up on your screen. And we'll give you a little time to participate and select one of the questions or one of the answers. Okay, and we're going to close the poll in about 5 seconds. Wonderful, thank you for your participation. So in answer to question 1, which is at this point in time, to what extent do you have leadership support for implementing the Zero Suicide Workforce Development Survey? We actually had 25% across the board of our participants in not yet, beginning to engage in discussion and commitment. All right, and I'm going to launch our second poll question. So you should see it come up on your screen momentarily. And we're going to close the poll in about 5 seconds. Thank you again for participating. In answer to the question or to the statement, we regularly assess staff in our organization about their readiness to screen and assess for suicidality. 27% of respondents replied true and 73% replied false.
Okay, Zan, are you in any position to reiterate the results of the first question on the poll?
I believe I can. Hold on one moment. Yes, so in answer to the first question, so there were 4 answer options and we received 25% for each question. So 25%
I
replied
see.
not yet.
Interesting.
Yes.
Okay. So we are in various stages of adoption, participants on the phone, and it looks like in terms of actually assessing in the past, we've got about 1/4 of our participants who have done some level of assessment. Okay, great. That gives both you some means of reflecting as to where you are in this adoption process and leadership engagement, and gives us some idea as well. Thank you. I do always reiterate that one of the primary goals of Zero Suicide is to destigmatize mental health and suicide, and one of the ways that we can do that is through our use of language. So please practice using the language on the left and avoid the language on the right. So we will say death by suicide, someone took his or her own life, someone died by suicide or killed themselves, or it was a suicide death. A very quick reiteration about Zero Suicide as a commitment to suicide prevention, and it's both a set of principles and evidence-based practices. There are three central facets to Zero Suicide, and Workforce Development Survey implementation actually relates to all three. In the core values, we assess continuity of care and promoting a culture of shared responsibility across professionals and staff who deliver service. In systems management, we take a look at policies and procedures and collaboration and communication, and we make a commitment to a trained and skilled workforce. And in the Workforce Development Survey, we examine the current use and the need for training on evidence-based practices, including screening and assessment, suicide-focused care, collaborative safety planning, suicide treatment for suicidality, and care coordination and caring contact. This graphic's designed to underscore the critical linkages between the different elements of care in the system. These are the evidence-based practices which will be assessed in the Workforce Development Survey. And again, this is Vermont's graphic that outlines the various stages of intervention and the evidence-based practices that are used at each stage. And these are all assessed in the Workforce Development Survey. These are the things leadership can do to support the implementation of a zero suicide approach. And you'll see that the bottom four flow from the work done under the top two. At the first stage of this project, the initiation process, leadership engages key staff who will help guide the adoption of zero suicide principles and practices into a core steering team, and then uses tools to assess current state in order to determine workforce development priorities. At this point, I'd like to turn this presentation over to Dr. Tom Delaney, who has worked with us over the past few years on aiding the three pilot sites in Vermont to use the Zero Suicide Organizational Self-Assessment and Workforce Development Survey. He will share with you some of what we have learned.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Joellen. This slide just gives you a sense of what the online version of the Zero Suicide Workforce Development Survey looks like. I'm just going to call it the Workforce Survey for the rest of the remainder of the talk. It's pretty straightforward to fill out. I do want to make a couple comments about why it's important. So among the elements of Zero Suicide, the Workforce Development Survey is pretty important both for the training element of Zero Suicide implementation, but also for the leadership. So it provides a role, it serves a role of providing pretty important information to leadership. And it's also part of comprehensive planning process because it includes assessment of the workforce, how engaged the workforce is, and it really supports planning around workforce development. Next slide. So the Vermont version of the national version was adapted in several ways, but it preserves most of the items from the national version. And so that way we get to keep most of our comparability with the national survey. The Vermont version emphasizes experience with specific evidence-based practices and trainings that the Vermont sites are adapting. And so really the tool, how it's been implemented with us, is that it's about 40 items, which takes a lot of people, maybe 15 minutes to complete. We are conducting it annually at each of the participating designated agencies. And we try to make sure that everybody at each agency who's in any way touching the Zero Suicide implementation has the opportunity to complete the survey. We also, because we're doing this survey both with people who've been trained on the evidence-based practices and people who haven't been trained on the evidence-based practice, which is CAMS, Collaborative Assessment and Management of Suicidality, We like to do our data analysis that way. We actually like to see separately the responses for people who are CAMS trained versus not trained. And I'll give you a couple of examples of what those data look like. Next slide. So why would we even bother doing this? I mentioned a couple of things having to do with leadership and understanding the workforce, but the survey results really give you a sense of the readiness of staff and programs for providing suicide-safer care, which is obviously important for workforce planning, identifying training needs, learning the impacts of implementing evidence-based practices. So we've actually learned a lot in Vermont about how well CAMS has been adapted, or adopted, I guess, by the participating programs, agencies, and clinicians. And it's been really well received. It's probably worth saying that. It also serves It also serves to familiarize the workforce a little bit with zero suicide. So at the start of the survey, we actually do a little bit of orientation of the survey taker towards zero suicide in their program in case they're not familiar with it or they haven't seen it in a little while. The survey results really help us understand how systems are changing as well. So by looking at how different agencies are responding, or participants from different agencies are responding, we get a sense of how different aspects of zero suicide are being adopted and implemented. And lastly, it does provide a basis for starting suicide-specific quality improvement work, which is yet another aspect, continuous quality improvement, of the zero suicide approach. Next slide. So we can go straight into the, some example findings. One thing I'll note, so the next slide, one thing I'll note is that with 40 questions, we actually get a ton of data. So this really is just a taste of some of the things that we're learning. And one of the ways that we organize the data is actually based on whether the survey taker has themselves worked with a client who has taken their lives. And unfortunately, what we've learned is that between 40 and 50% of the people taking the survey have actually lost a client. So either during the time that they were working with that client or in the perhaps months or years after they worked with them. And it turns out this might be an important aspect of the zero suicide workforce, is trying to understand the impact of having lost a client on the workforce members' attitudes and practices. We can go to the next slide. This is, sorry, previous one. The previous slide. Yeah, this one is also pretty helpful, I think. And what it does is it just asks people to indicate what prior training they have on suicide prevention or related to suicide prevention. And so at the top of the list, we have CAMS, which I mentioned earlier, which is good to see that many people are reporting having been trained on that model. We also have a lot of people, well, over a quarter, saying that they've worked or been trained on dialectical behavioral therapy. And about a quarter have also done CALM training. That's counseling on access to lethal means. The CALM training is actually a strongly recommended training as part of Vermont's implementation of zero suicide. It's a free online training, takes about an hour and a half or 2 hours. It's a pretty good one. We also have a good number of respondents who indicated they'd done one of the Matter trainings or AMSR or QPR trainings as well. So you can imagine that having the snapshot, especially at the beginning of implementing zero suicide, could be really important and maybe suggest some areas where training could be built out to strengthen the workforce. Next
Tom,
slide.
can I ask a question? I'm impressed with the fact that almost 38% of the staff that you've surveyed have indicated CAMS training. Is this a reflection of post 3-year implementation?
It's a little bit cumulative, and it doesn't have all of the year 3 data, just because one of the DAs is still doing the survey for year 3, so it doesn't have all of the 2018 data.
Okay, because I think at baseline we would not have seen that. Is that correct?
No way. I would
Yeah.
be surprised if more than a handful had been trained on CAMS at
Right,
the
right.
start.
So this also gives you some indication about being able to measure change in participation over time. So it's great. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so this is packing two graphs into one slide, but I think they're pretty straightforward graphs, so it should be okay. On the left, we have a pie chart, and it just asks people who have been trained on the CAMS model as part of Zero Suicide to indicate, really to estimate how many clients they've used CAMS with. And this is really about adoption. We want to see among the CAMS trained clinicians, how many are actually using it as a regular part of their practice. And what we find is that over half of the CAMS trained clinicians have used it substantially. So this is, again, getting back to a little earlier in 2018, but more than half of the clinicians have used it with at least 3 to 4 clients so far. So that to me suggests that on average, we're having a relatively good uptake of the CAMS model with clients. And then on the right, we have a bar chart that just asks clinicians to rate how helpful they believe that the CAMS model work has been with the clients that they've used CAMS with. And what you can see is that the vast majority, over 90% of respondents in this survey, believe that the CAMS work they've done with their clients at risk for suicide has either been mostly helpful or very helpful. Next slide. This slide's a little more complicated. I apologize for that. But in a nutshell, it shows 2 different questions. One question summarized on the left half, the other summarized on the right half. And then each question is broken out by whether the respondents are generally part of the Zero Suicide implementation, which is the far left bar, versus specifically CAMS trained people. So those are actually clinicians who are using the CAMS model. And so if you look at those 2 bars on the left, the gray area is showing us that among all the Zero Suicide respondents, about 80% say that they bring up the topic of suicide with clients whenever they suspect there might be a risk of suicide. That goes up to 100% among clinicians who are actually trained on CAMS. So that does suggest to me something about the value and the added benefit of people participating in the training model. And then on the right side, we get a similar question, and it's asking people to rate their agreement with the statement, I bring up the topic of suicide with clients when their records indicate there's any history of suicidal thoughts or behaviors. And we get almost the same answer. So among non-CAMS trained people, we have about 4 out of 5 say that they do bring up suicide, but universally it's brought up by the CAMS trained clinicians. Next slide. And actually, this will be the last slide before we transition to Michael Hartman, who will talk a little bit. And this is also a slightly complicated slide, so I apologize. The bars that are laying on their sides, the horizontal bars, are indicating for each of the different training areas where people would like to have more training. And the horizontal bars, are out of all the survey respondents. So we have a lot of survey respondents who are indicating that they want more training on crisis response procedures, so that's slightly over 50%, managing suicidal patients and clients, identifying risk factors and warning signs, and then that tapers all the way down to only about 1 out of 4 people indicate that they want to, or they feel they need more information about epidemiology and the latest research. Now, the circles on this graph are interesting, I think, because those are for the CAMS trained clinicians. And what you see is that once people have gone through CAMS, they're identifying some different needs for additional training, resources, or support. And so in general, they're needing less of the things that are being identified among all the people participating in Zero Suicide, with the exception of epidemiology and the latest research, where the CAMS clinicians slightly more likely to say that they would like more information in those areas. So now we'll transition to Michael, who's going to talk a bit about the workforce survey and how they've used it at Lamoille County Mental Health Services.
Thank you. Michael, before you start, I do want to make a comment about the importance of the data on CAMS trained clinicians about staff roles and responsibilities within your work environment, which, as we know, is a very big focus for the Zero Suicide project, is to really get clarity between who is identifying, who is assessing, how we refer to treatment. And so this implies to me an emphasis on greater understanding about protocols in the organization and between the organization and partner organizations. And I think that's just a really, really good outcome to see. On to you, Michael.
Thank you, Joellen, and thank you, Tom. I think I want to focus, as you can see on the slide here, the questions that are posed here, but also feather in a little bit of what Tom was talking about in terms of looking at this from a provider perspective. So as I spoke to last time when we talked before about, the most important thing about the survey, or two most important things, are having a team or a committee, whatever structure your organization has, of people who are attending to this particular issue within the organization. And always that is best if it's a wide representative group. So it involves all aspects of care, but also admin people and other players in your organization who may have contact with patients, clients, or people who may have less than direct contact, so some support staff as well. And that's one of the important pieces. But the other is the leadership of the organization strongly endorsing the Zero Suicide approach and the efforts being made by the organization. Every time we do the workforce development survey, which we just completed the third time, we always started off by having people who are on the committee, who are, again, in each of our divisions, bring this up at staff meetings, talk to staff about it in general, get people aware that we're about ready to do the survey. When it's time to issue the survey, it comes in the form of a letter email to all staff from the executive director. We've also gotten endorsements from the board president in order to make it clear that this is maybe not the typical sort of effort you're making, but it's something that has a higher level of attention. And that endorsement seems to help quite a bit, because each time we've had among the highest responses of the 3 pilot agencies, and I think that has been really helpful in doing that. So as I said, the administration of this is through SurveyMonkey kind of approach, and so the email goes out to staff. We ask them to complete it online. We help people get access if they need that for some reason to being able to do that. And we, through the time after that email goes out to say, this is the survey, this is what we're doing, we follow up with, again, having key members of the committee talk about this in departmental meetings so that there is some extra conversation happening about getting it done. We bug Tom to give us numbers after about every 2 to 4 weeks so that we can come back and say to the whole agency, here's what we've gotten for a response so far, and we're doing well, or we're maybe a little bit behind where we were last year, and try to get the message out that if people just take the 5 to 10 minutes to fill this out, that it's really beneficial to us. And that, again, has worked well, that we've seen a little bump happen after the initial piece. People open the survey up and do it. Some people open it up and then say, oh, I'll do that later. So we get some of those later people to come back and attend to it by about, as I said, about every 2 to 4 weeks, giving them some message, and again, having the committee members talk about it. Our committee meets every 2 weeks, so we're able to kind of keep that pretty live for about 6 to 8 weeks, getting people to respond to that. And in terms of how this is useful, I think the data that Tom showed you is important in terms of understanding what your staff or the folks who are going to be involved with your effort, what is their background and experience in this? You know, we found that we had a lower number of people who had had some direct experience with a client who had caught myself there, Joanne, who had killed themselves. And but it ended up being just 35% of people. And so we had to really start from a place where most people we're working with, or half or more, don't have a direct knowledge. And I'd say a lot of them end up, if we sat down with them and went through who they have worked with, it may turn out that they actually have had contact or worked with somebody who killed themselves but didn't know it when that's how the person had died. So you know, there could be some different answers there, but on the whole, we're a designated agency at Lamoille County Mental Health. We have about a 20% plus new group of folks who come into work for us over any 18-month period or so. So a lot of them, because we're a small rural agency, we get a lot of people who are starting their careers in mental health. So often we have people coming in who have not very much experience. And so we want to make sure that we're doing trainings and information distribution in a manner that really addresses that group of people need a lot of attention, while at the same time not overwhelming the people who have experience and knowledge with information that's not helpful to them. Another aspect, I think, when you're looking at this at an organizational level that was helpful with the survey is just being clear about the roles of who is out there, who's involved in this process in terms of their roles. In general, we have a small group, maybe 20% or less of our staff who are involved in this project because we do it as a broad agency, not just in outpatient or just in one program, but we're doing it across all of our programs, that only about 25 to 35% of our staff are licensed, trained, directing treatment. We have a larger number of people who are in managers, coordinators who do some direct care. 50% or less of their duties are direct care, and 50% or more are management or coordination services. We have about 15% of our group that are people who are involved in crisis services. And so knowing what kind of, where your bubble is of the people who may have the most direct responsibility for doing the intervention work that your organization may do, and that could vary hugely on whether you're a hospital or a mental health center or a substance use treatment center. But in any case, I think it helps, again, to kind of give you a snapshot of who it is you're trying to inform and train. And then again, one of the other questions is about the length of time that people have been in those roles. And that's another helpful piece because, as I said, in our case, it's a pretty large number of people who have been here 1 to 3 years. It's a pretty small number of our percentage, probably 15 to 20% at most, who have been here for more than 10 years. So we have a challenge in being able to keep the balance of these different groups in terms of what is their day-to-day experience, what is their role, and what can we expect from them in terms of being part of this process, and what do we need to do in terms of training them. And as Tom also pointed out in the data he showed, that the question of people having experience with this subject is very significant. The numbers of people who feel they know something about suicide or have been always high in our surveys. But when we get down to the more granular question, like having skills to screen and assess a patient's or a client's suicidal risk, receiving training on how to do that specific engagement. I think as you saw in the previous slide of Tom's, that 37% had done the CAMS training. And again, this survey is limited to the agencies that have been involved for the last 3 or 4 years in training people in CAMS, et cetera, and using that and building that as part of their system. So you can see that there are still significant numbers of people who have not yet had that training, or may not know how to use that training as well. Again, looking at the questions around how confident do you feel in using the skills that you've learned. That's another area where the scores tend to be lower, and that people have not had a great deal of experience, and that's again another area that, as you're looking to do the plan that we talked about last time, the organizational self-assessment, that you get this data, and we as a group have found this to be extremely helpful in figuring out where our kind of soft spots were organizationally, where we needed to spend more time. That over time we've learned, for instance, that our residential programs, where we have staff spend the most time with individuals, are in some of the highest need of having a training, not so much on how to do a therapeutic level, therapist trained level of intervention, but how to feel comfortable with conversing with residents about suicide, how to recognize signs where it may be necessary to do that. And again, from our perspective, one of our goals in our work here is not to wait for a client to necessarily bring this up, but strategically trying to ask questions, 2 specific questions on wishing they were dead or wouldn't wake up, and if they have had thoughts of killing themselves, that we've incorporated that as a mental health center into a lot of our contact strategies for consumers, because we want to make sure that it's not just relying on the client or consumer to bring up the issue, but that we're able to actually sort of do an outward directed intervention and bring up the subject so that we can have people feel more comfortable. Because again, often when a client is asked the question, they rarely take offense or have any significant negative response to it. They either will just say, no, that's not why I'm here, or they actually will start talking about it, and it gives you an earlier opportunity to start an intervention than you might have if it was all up to having the client put forth their concerns. So again, I think for us this has been a really valuable tool. It kind of juxtaposed with the organizational self-assessment and the work plan that comes out of the other side of this. These things all work together to help a part-time committee of people put together a plan, and in our case, ultimately, this plan led to us having a very detailed protocol about what people do in every role that we are constantly revising and adding to in terms of trying to get staff to that comfort level with the subject matter. So I think that covers pretty much the areas that I wanted to address. And again, I always want to thank Tom and Joellen and the staff at the Center for Health and Learning in terms of the supports and tools and materials that have assisted us in developing the survey, doing the survey. Tom's really good and a pretty good cheerleader about helping you make things happen. And Joellen is equally talented in that area. And it's been a very positive experience for us. So I'll turn it back to you, Joellen.
Sorry, I was muted while I was speaking, so I've unmuted myself. Thank you very much, Michael. I think that there's been a tremendous amount of collegiality between the field, the evaluation component of this work, and the technical assistance, project management, and coordination components, and that strengthens everybody's work. In terms of the organizations who are listening in, I wanted to just end by having you think a little bit about your next steps. You are surely at this point in time deciding whether to identify who you would engage in a zero suicide core team and consider the role or the work of the workforce development survey and how that would serve as a means of engaging your staff. Collecting valuable information as well for your program development process. Vermont Suicide Prevention Center is surely interested in forging new partnerships with additional healthcare organizations in working with you to support workforce development survey implementation, reporting, follow-up planning. And what we're most interested in is continuing to create a learning community in Vermont around zero suicide and sharing in a collegial way as organizations experience initiation, adoption, implementation, and evaluation of their efforts. Again, upcoming webinar number 5 next week on identification, assessment, treatment of suicidality, in which we will feature Adam Lesser of the Columbia Lighthouse Project, in which he'll give a quick introduction to the Columbia Suicide Severity Rating Scale, and Kevin Crowley of CAMS Care, who will give an introduction to identification and assessment tools, focusing on the CAMS, Collaborative Assessment for the Management of Suicide. Oops. In winding up, we always want to point you towards the predominant sources of help for people who are experiencing suicidality. This postcard and other resources that we present are available for download on the Vermont Suicide Prevention Center. So we just want to wind up by pointing you to 2 very good sources of support and information related to zero suicide. On the National Suicide Prevention Resource Center website, all the national resources, many tools, articles, and tools for zero suicide are found, along with training and videos, including information and specific training modules, even related to various aspects of zero suicide. And also under support from the Vermont Department of Mental Health, the Vermont Suicide Prevention Center continues to update the Vermont Suicide Prevention Center website, which you can access at www.vtspc.org. If you follow the links to zero suicide under resources, you will find both the OSA and the Workforce Development Survey. If you don't find what you need, please feel free to contact us. To access the webinar recordings for today's webinar and this entire series and slides, you go to this link, vtspc.org/0-suicide-page/. This is also in your chat box, so please access whatever resources we have presented there. In summary, leadership commitment and support are critical, along with a dedicated team to champion your effort and see it through. The Zero Suicide Workforce Development Survey is designed as an assessment and planning tool. It also serves as an engagement tool and determines where your organization needs to build capacity. And finally, we are learning from early adopters, and please keep in mind the many resources that are available to assist you with this work. Finally, as we do in all of our webinars and presentations, which engage people who do this hard and challenging and rewarding work, we encourage you to take care of yourself. Thank you for the work you do, and please stay online because an evaluation will pop up momentarily, and we very much value your input, feedback, and use it for quality improvement and decision making. Have a great day.